Yo, what up y'all? IntraVenus here, back with another episode. And today I wanted to talk about a topic that I've been really thinking a lot about lately. And that is gaming on a budget. You know, things are getting pretty expensive these days all around. And some of us don't have money for things like a PlayStation 5. And I don't have a PlayStation 5 yet. I could save up for one or whatnot, but I just can't really get myself to drop $500 on a console. I feel like there's a lot of other things I could buy for that much money. So, I've been seeing all of these Chinese handhelds coming out, and I have several of them. Some of them can be really good, and some of them not so much. And that goes right along with gaming on a budget, because that can apply to the Chinese handhelds on the higher end as well as the lowest end. So what I did here, and maybe I'll do a couple more times with some different devices, is I went on AliExpress and I searched for the cheapest retro handhelds that had emulators that would play some sort of collection of ROMs. And for the under $20 mark, I came across this as being the most intriguing. And doing some research, the RETROMINI is actually kind of a pioneer of all these handhelds that we play today, and it came out around 2018, I believe. After it was followed up by stronger versions with better screens and whatnot. I had the Retro Game 300, which I think is one of the close to, if not immediate successors to this. Now, full disclosure, I've already opened this, but there's a reason, because this doesn't really perform that great right out of box. I ordered it because it is technically a variation of the Game Boy Advance Micro. They use what seems to be the exact same screen pulled out of a Game Boy Advance Micro. It just has emulation in there. It comes with like 300 or 400 Game Boy Advance games, something like that. Maybe it was less, like 200. But none of the games would play very well. They were all kind of stuttery. It seemed like they didn't run well, and it wasn't worth playing. The audio was all skippy. The gameplay itself was stuttering, and I was pretty disappointed. Luckily, I looked online, and there's a whole community that a few years ago, around 2020, they worked on getting this to work with opendingux, which is an open source software that you can install on here. It's custom firmware to replace the lame version that they had on here. And when you get this stock, it comes with sort of a user experience that has like a music player and games and a video player. It does have a headphone jack. We got a slider wheel for volume. It's got L and R buttons. It's got all the buttons you need for Game Boy Advance and below. But it didn't play Game Boy Advance well, so I went online, I figured out how to install opendingux, and got this custom firmware on here. Now the custom firmware really changes the game here. This still isn't for everybody, but it is now a fully fledged tiny Game Boy. Because I found that after installing this software and tinkering, I added every Nintendo game, every Sega Genesis game, every Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance game. And what I found is it actually played the Sega games and the Nintendo games, but this tiny screen just wasn't what I needed. It didn't really show the text properly because the ratio's all wonky. So I took off the full screen consoles you'd find at your home, like the Genesis, the NES. Super Nintendo was on there, but you don't even have the right number of buttons to play it. So got all that off of there. And I just decided to go with Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance. And I did a lot of tinkering. And what I found is, even with a lot of tinkering, this thing doesn't really play Game Boy Advance that well. So I took the Game Boy Advance off there, and now I use it for Game Boy. So I just wanted to show in this video that the RETROMINI, also known as the RS90, can be set up for Game Boy and Game Boy Color games, and it can run them pretty well. Actually, it seems to run Game Boy nearly flawlessly. And then the Game Boy Color games, they run seemingly just as well, yet they do have some stuttering in some of the audio. So here we have RetroArch installed on here with opendingux, and I can go into load content. Under downloads I have Game Boy and Game Boy Color. Under Game Boy I have every game from Europe, Japan, homebrews, hacks, all that stuff. And then on Game Boy Color I just have a list of all the Game Boy Colors, all the games that ever came out for it. So I just wanted to show you guys how well this thing can play Game Boy, and maybe you'll decide that if you like tinkering, you really have to like tinkering, and I can show you the settings that I used to make this work properly, because it did take a lot of tinkering, especially to get the audio to work right after I got the video to work right. But it works, and it works well now. So let's just take a look at some games. I'd like y'all to let me know in the comments if you own one of these, if you've added opendingux. Do you have any recommendations for how I can get this to work better? I know that you can add your own different emulators outside of RetroArch and stuff like that, but I haven't really tried too much with that. I tried drag and dropping some in there just like I did with RetroArch, but they didn't show up, so I just decided to use RetroArch. So we'll go ahead and start off with something simple like Super Mario Land. Hopefully y'all can see that this thing is tiny, but it's actually, I got it running here with I got him running here with this the Game Boy Color system, so it's adding its own color, because you can have it run. There's a lot of settings you can do in the background, but it can only handle so much in this thing. So you can get it to do Game Boy Color as the main console it's emulating, so when you play your Game Boy games it's adding color to them, which is nice. But you can see here that I've actually got Game Boy working on this thing really well. And essentially, that's what this is a tiny Game Boy. That's what I looked at it as, and that's kind of what I wanted it as. It's disappointing that it doesn't play Game Boy Advance games well. At least I couldn't get them to work well enough that I decided to take them off entirely, unless you know otherwise. But, I mean, Game Boy, if you want a little tiny Game Boy, and you don't mind some tinkering, you don't want to spend, there's a lot of different price variations for tiny Game Boys right now, and you can spend upwards of $100 for a tiny Game Boy type emulating device. But you know, mostly with something this small and smaller, I wouldn't want to be emulating anything but Game Boy and Game Boy Color. So this is kind of right where it's at for me. I like it, and being able to spend $20 or less is a sweet spot for sure. So I just want to show you a little bit of what is going on here. Let's pick some things like we could do some Pokemon. And this does do save states. Everything is just accessed by pressing the start and select buttons. You could do save states in there. It does support saving in game, but I don't really trust that. I'm pretty sure that save file would become corrupt pretty easily. See, I do have a save state there. I mean, like the actual save in the game. But it's probably a better idea to use save states. I'm mostly just doing this to test out that it can save ROMs. So one thing to note here is if you get one of these, this little slider is real sensitive. You could just barely move it up from no volume, just barely, and it'll get loud quick. You have to go very slowly. Like really, really slowly. I was actually thinking about putting a little rubber gasket or something in there to make this move slow and smooth, because it would make it operate a lot better, because you could get pretty loud on here. You won't notice with this particular volume on this game, but here we have Zelda. You know, Oracle of Ages and Seasons, got them on here. Game Boy Color. And there's an example of one of the other gripes about this thing. And you're probably going to run into that with cheap devices like this. Is sometimes it could also be the ROM that you try to load. You go to load a certain ROM and it freezes the console. And then you have to switch it off, switch it back on, and either try that ROM again or try a different ROM. And well, that can be annoying. But it doesn't happen to me enough that I don't want to use it. In fact, it seems to be pretty much based on the ROMs that I use, so it doesn't seem to like ROM hacks so much. I've actually gotten Pokemon Orange to go on here, but every other time I try to run it, it freezes the console for some reason. So, you know, stick to the original game ROMs and none of the hacks from more present times, and this thing will actually be pretty decent. Pretty much worth its while. The battery life, it could probably goes for like 2 or 3 hours. It charges really quick. It does have this sleep function where it turns off the screen really quick if you want. And it does have 9 settings of brightness once you add opendingux. I got it at halfway right now. I think it comes with 5 settings of brightness before you add the opendingux. Opendingux opens it up, pun intended. So, what do y'all think about this device? I really like it for what it is. And I like the fact that I enjoyed tinkering with it. There was a lot of tinkering involved, but I was successful for what I wanted to accomplish, and that's a good feeling. If you like tinkering and you want a tiny Game Boy, then you might want to check this out. The RETROMINI. It's simple. And there's not a whole lot to it, but man, you know, sometimes it's fun to be able to get so much out of so little. When you get it, you'll just get it in a little bag here in this little holster tray. It'll come with the old school micro USB cable. You'll get your micro SD card in a separate little container there, and you'll have to pop it in on the side yourself right here. And you get a little user manual, which doesn't say a whole lot, but it does have some pictures here that show you what the original UI looked like. the user interface there. Had an MP3 player and stuff. I think you can add a music player to this still through opendingux if you want it for that. I mean, it did work as a cheap MP3 player with some, you know, very minimalistic designs popping up on the screen, animation when you're listening to music. You might find it interesting just for that, kind of. I mean, do you use MP3 players? I don't know. Some people do. A lot of us just put it on our phones. But I don't know. I mean, let me know down in the comments what you think about this. I'm thinking about replacing the screen with one of these aftermarket LCD screens that they make for the Game Boy Micro, because it is the exact same. You can see through here it's got the same connections, and I'm wondering if those aftermarket screens look better than this one. I'm not sure. Anyhow, thanks for sticking around to the end of the episode. Hit the like and subscribe buttons if you like this and you're not subscribed already. It really inspires me to make more videos like this, and let me know if you're interested in gaming on a budget, because I'm thinking about checking out some of these other, like, really inexpensive handhelds now that we're getting so advanced, and I want to go back in time and see what we can do with the older ones, you know. So until next time, I'll catch y'all on the flip. Peace out.
That was just childhood. We were all there together, and in denial would play like it was forever. And in the tall woods, we'd stay out of the weather like it was all good. Every day we made it for pleasure. We were saying whatever came to our minds, plain and simple like a tether ball reaching the sky. We were taking new heights on the swing while it was making us fly. Beat the king of the hill and everything will be fine. The thrill